Hi, this is Misha, and this video is a long time in coming, really. A couple of years ago we did a video on U.S. military shotguns, focusing on both the riot type and the trench gun type. And this firearm was featured in that video, including shooting it. And we said eventually we would do a dedicated review of it. So this is the Ithaca M37 Trench Gun, and this is a reproduction manufactured by Ithaca in Ohio of the Vietnam era version. Now there are a few differences from original, but they're actually very minor, and a couple are even quite good. But we'll get into that. And just so we didn't have one gun on the table, I also brought out another trench gun. This is my Mossberg M590A1. This is the mil version, and this is in several videos. I just brought it out because it's another trench gun. In a way, this is kind of the successor to the M37, and yes, it has a heat shield. When I posted a video several years ago on this, people were doubting if this was actually a 590A1 because of having a heat shield, but this is the correct one, the correct part. They are gettable if you look around, and I found a few years ago. Anyway, just thought I'd bring that out. We'll talk about both of them a little more. Well, first off, terminology. What's the difference between a riot shotgun and a trench shotgun, or just trench gun? It's pretty easy. Riot guns have 18-inch barrels, and trench guns typically have 20 or sometimes 21. Riot guns tend to be the standard civilian or at most police configuration, so usually hold 4+1 or maybe 5+1, whereas the trench gun will have a heat shield, bayonet lug, and can have a standard capacity, as this one does here. This is a 4+1, or an extended capacity, as this Mossberg here, which is an 8+1, so 9-shot. Basically, trench guns are longer, and they're meant for more frontline or trench use, because these came into heavy use in World War I by America, hence the name. Whereas military purchase versions of the riot gun would be used more for prisoner guarding, MP duty, more civilian, more base type duties, because they were less ornate, lighter weight, shorter, so on and so forth. So the military did buy both riot configuration and trench configuration of miniguns. Kind of going back in the history just a smidge. Again, we have a full video on the history of the service gun, so if that interests you, check that out. I know it's an older video, but still valid. The first military combat shotgun was the Winchester 1897. It was a design by John Moses Browning. It had an exposed hammer, had a 5+1 capacity with a 20-inch barrel. It had a heat shield and a bayonet lug, not dissimilar to what's on this one. It was a whole assembly, basically dropped onto a Winchester barrel. From what I can remember, the heat shield bayonet assemblies were actually manufactured by Springfield, or at least they were designed at the Springfield Armory. And actually they would be fitted to several versions, not just the Winchester M97. They would be on the later Winchester Model 12, M12, and several other versions that were in smaller use. There were some Savages and Stevens. There was even a Remington or two back then, although they used a different assembly. There were quite a few. It's worth pointing out that the military only purchased about 40,000 shotguns for World War I, but they did see heavy use. And I'll mention this, it'll be valid when we get to Vietnam in just a minute. For World War II, they pulled out some of the old 1897s, also the newer Winchester Model 12s. They contracted, as I said, with Savage and Stevens to build shotguns for them. These were all pump, 12 gauge, 2 3/4 chambers. They even had a few semi-autos, such as the Savage 720 and the Remington Model 11, but these were mostly for training or even base recreation. Sometimes they would use them for competition shooting, even maybe some light hunting on base on days off. There are unconfirmed reports that some of the Savages and Remingtons might have made it over to the Pacific, and that's really where the shotgun came into heavy use. Now, the European theater always kind of got the best hardware, the first M1 Grands, the first carbines, the more modern pistols. So the bolt action 1903 stayed in service in the Pacific longer and took longer to get Grands. I mean, come on, they even had the Rising submachine gun instead of the Thompson or the grease gun. Rising. And this is also why a few of Melvin Johnson's M41s went over there. They needed whatever they could get. So they were happy to get shotguns, and the pump shotgun performed very well in the Pacific. And this is where Ithaca comes into the game. This design is also a modification of Browning, or specifically it's a modification of an older Remington design that Browning worked on, that the Ithaca company, then in New York, introduced in 1937 as both a sports and law enforcement shotgun. When originally introduced, there were several barrel lengths down to 18 inches and out to at least 26 or 30. The civilian ones would have a nice blued finish. They would have this very ornate field and game scene etched into the side of the receiver. They would have very ornate walnut engraved furniture. You know how shotguns are, all kinds of options. What makes this unique, as you see, this is a slab side here, but unlike other shotguns, it's a slab here. It feeds and ejects from the same port on the bottom. This gives several benefits. One, you have far less chance of something getting into the action, mud, dirt, sand, snow, whatever, even water. Two, since you have an uninterrupted receiver, it's stronger. Even though it's actually relatively thin steel, it's quite strong and durable just for being solid. It also makes it effectively close to ambidextrous. Your safeties here, it's a cross bolt type, which could be used by either hand. We also have the shell release here in the front, which is on the right side, but can still be relatively easily used left-handed. There's your ejector and lift. So it was kind of ahead of its time. And a typical Browning design, very simple and elegant and very effective. Now the civilian version also is quite easy to at least take the barrel off of. It's threaded with an interrupted thread into the receiver. You just twist it off 90 degrees. When you get to the military version, because of the heat shield assembly, you have to unscrew it and remove it first before you can remove the barrel, but it's in there here and there. There were several police versions made over the years. These would have more of a matte blued finish and could have furniture very similar to this, more just plain walnut with an oil finish. They would take the field and game etching off the side of the receiver for the police guns. And they would do these in 18 and 20 inch. And if you got the 20 inch police gun, it would actually have an extended tube going out to the end of the barrel. Whereas this holds 4+1, it could hold 7+1 at its maximum length. But these were not service guns for the military, these were police guns. It is worth noting that the military did buy riot versions of the Ithaca 37, but as for the trench gun, which is what we care about here, during World War II, the military only picked up about 1,500 Ithaca M37 trench guns. They had other contracts going on. It was kind of just a supplemental contract. But keep in mind, in World War I, we only had 40,000 guns, so even 1,500 is a not insignificant percentage. The World War II guns would have the standard blued finish, because a lot of these were off-the-shelf guns picked up at the last minute. They would have a 20-inch barrel, heat shield assembly, as you see here. It would take the 1917 infield pattern of bayonet, which was originally what the Winchester 1897 took. This is because Winchester was the manufacturer of the M1917. And this would actually continue on for a very long time, this bayonet being used on various trench guns. And obviously these 1,500 World War II era Ithacas really wouldn't make an impact on the war. Most of them probably never even left the U.S. Well, let's fast forward through Korea. After World War I and World War II, the military has plenty of leftover Winchesters and other guns, so they don't really order any new shotguns during Korea, at least if they do, no new Ithacas. But Vietnam, this is when the Ithaca's day comes, and this is where this gun is most well known. It all began in 1962 when the U.S. government negotiated a contract with Ithaca, still in New York, to produce riot versions of the M37, so 18-inch barrel, no heat shield, 4+1 capacity, for the Vietnamese government, South Vietnam. This would go well. And again, in 1962, the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam was truly just as an advisor. But at 64, 65, the U.S. starts to send ground troops. And as the military learned in the Pacific in World War II, the shotgun is actually a very good weapon for jungle, tropical warfare. But by the mid-60s, the older guns were really wearing out, being destroyed, parts were hard to get, yada, yada, yada. They needed new trench guns. So in 1967, the government filed another contract with Ithaca for 20-inch barreled M37 trench guns, this time to be used by Americans. And that's where this gun's reputation really became entrenched in the later years of the Vietnam War. These were issued to men on point, some special forces, plenty of guard units. In the 60s, they would manufacture about 22,000. And like I said, this is where the original number of 40,000 comes into play. 22,000 does not sound like a large number until you realize just how few shotguns the U.S. military typically buys. Now, the Stevens 77E was still the most common shotgun used in Vietnam, but it wasn't a trench gun per se. Its configuration, although it was militarized with sling swivels, was not with the heat shield and bayonet lug. The Ithaca was the most common trench gun that was manufactured during the Vietnam period. It would be serving alongside newcomers such as the Winchester Model 1200, Remington 870, and a very newcomer to the market, which only was introduced on the civilian market in America in 1962, the Mossberg Model 500. So of these guns, the Ithaca was actually the oldest design. Now, one nice thing, this is not a terribly heavy shotgun. It was actually quite a bit lighter than the 1897 Winchester, and still more than a half pound lighter than a lot of newer guns like the Model 12. It's under 7 pounds, even with this heat shield and bayonet lug on. If you were to take this assembly off, you would strip at least another pound off, probably even a little more. So for a trench gun, it was quite light. This was good for people slogging in the jungle. Also good because 12 gauge shells, while they deliver quite a bit of punch close in for the jungle, good dispersion, they're heavy. I mean, 12 gauge weighs significantly more than 223 and even more than 308. So you want it to be effective and you want your gun to be as light as possible. Of course, the flip side is it does mean a little more recoil. The Vietnam era M37 was extremely similar to this gun here. Had a parkerized phosphated finish, oil finish furniture, had a very thin rubberized butt plate, hard rubber, maybe even plastic. I've seen it called both rubber and plastic. It had a 2 3/4 chamber, sling swivels, a brass bead front sight, and a 20-inch cylinder bore barrel. It could also be famously known slam fired by holding it on the trigger. Which is a feature that the Winchesters had before it, which led to rapid firing, if not necessarily what we consider a safety feature today. So these saw service throughout Vietnam and were kept in inventory well into the 70s and into the 80s. Now, Ithaca would also produce a very, very close version of this, almost identical, for the law enforcement market in the 70s. So you can find some Vietnam era Ithaca M37 trench guns that look identical to military, except will not have the US property mark or inspection marks. So just be aware of that. There was a essentially civilian contract for these. Probably they were using up leftover parts, I would guess. They would produce these throughout the 70s. So Ithaca in New York would shut down and then reopen in the 21st century in Ohio. Essentially, the company was bought by new owners, including all the data, parts, machines, blueprints. And they began manufacturing a defense version, a hunting version. And back in 2016, they started manufacturing this version here. And I'm very happy they did, because even though this thing retails for around $1,000, even $1,100, that's significantly cheaper than finding an original US military M37 trench guns are easily $3,000, and who knows what condition they'll be in, and you still have to worry about fakes. There's been a lot of fakery because there's tons of just standard Ithaca police and hunting versions out there people could work with. And again, there are those guns that were made for this civilian contract, which are valuable but not as valuable as true military. What Ithaca, Ohio, has done here is make a very close reproduction, or even reissue, as some people like to call it, without making it obviously an attempt at a fake. One thing I like that they did, instead of being just a 2 3/4 chamber, this version can now fire 3-inch Magnum in addition to 2 3/4, so that's nice. We still have the 4+1 capacity. We have a parkerized finish. The controls are all the same. We have that same smooth action the M37 is known for. Even though this only has one action bar, I've never really heard of these binding up too badly or failing. It's a Browning design, so it works. We've got the corn cob front end. We've got a reproduction military style butt plate, as you already looked at. And to really cap things off, we have reproduction ordnance markings on the receiver, inspection stamps, and we even have the serial in the S range, which is what the original military contracts from the 60s were in, although obviously it's continuing on from there, so if you looked up the serial, it wouldn't be confused with an original. Also, the barrel is marked for Ohio, not New York. So that's what Ithaca's does. They make a 20-inch gun with the 4+1 capacity. Now this assembly is actually manufactured by Inland Manufacturing, which is a new company that kind of bought the old name, or at least uses the old name, also in Ohio, and it's a reproduction of the Springfield style with a spring steel heat shield. It does have the correct number of slots and holes. Oh, that's one thing I forgot to mention. The World War II guns had a slightly different heat shield versus the Vietnam. Sorry guys, a few different holes. Bayonet lug here. It clamps on to the barrel. So this is manufactured and installed by Inland, and this gun is sold through Inland and is manufactured exclusively for them by Ithaca. So while this isn't manufactured in New York by the original Ithaca company, at least it's not made, say, in China. It's made in the USA by an American company that actually obtained all the data, all the blueprints, even some parts and tooling from the original. So it's kind of a reinvention. I would definitely rather have it done this way than, say, you know, something else. I would say it's a little more legitimate than, say, a Springfield M1A being an M14, because at least the original Ithaca company supported the new Ithaca a bit more than the Springfield US-owned Arsenal ever did for the Springfield Armory owned by Reese family. Anyway, these are very nice guns. I've fired several of their reproduction guns for the defense and whatnot. They're as reliable. They seem as well made. Obviously, they're made with a few more modern manufacturing techniques. The barrels are still screwed into the receiver. Again, they're strengthened a bit for 3-inch Magnum. Actual walnut furniture, quite high grade. And this is a lot of fun to shoot because it is light. There is some recoil, but the trigger is actually very nice with a short pull and quite light. All the controls are easy to use. Loading shells is smooth and easy. We never really have had it bind up on us. So really the only knock to it is the cost, the price. But it is what it is. For someone wanting this for a collection, it would really go into Vietnam or trench gun setup. And at least you know what you're getting. You don't have to worry about buying an old gun, paying $2,000 or $3,000 for it, finding out it's a fake, or it's been shot so much that it doesn't work reliably. You know what you're getting here. I would say, you know, for a pure collector, this may not be there, but for someone who also shoots, this would be a great shooter alternative and awesome for reenactors. It will take the M1917 bayonet, either originals or, say, for example, the reproductions that Numeric had. And I've always had a thing for Ithacas. I don't own many shotguns, as anyone who watches the channel a lot knows, but I've always liked the M37. And this is a great classic trench gun to me. And, you know, it goes nicely alongside to have a classic trench gun with my modern trench gun here, my Mossberg, which is a little bit heavier, even though it has an alloy receiver. This takes the newer M7 bayonet, or M9. Basically it has a NATO bayonet lug. Heat shield's a different setup. It's no longer a piece with the lug. This is one of the guns that really replaced the M37 and other guns like the Winchester 1200 as they wore out in the 80s. First, the military would buy some 500s with some military updates. Then they would go to the 590, which we in the civilian market call the 590A1, which had a beefier barrel, all metal parts, more phosphated parts internally, yada yada yada. Again, this video is not about this. I just brought it out because why not? It's always good to have multiple things, right guys? Well, in conclusion, there should be a nice thorough review of this. I really have very little negative to say. I mean, part of that is it's a pump shotgun. You know, it works or it doesn't work. It's well made or it's not. Well, this is well made and it works. So it's a functioning 12 gauge pump shotgun. It's not terribly heavy, especially considering all the crap on the barrel. It's a nice reproduction without going crazy overboard, but they at least really put effort. For example, they could have very easily left the standard butt plate on, and probably most people wouldn't have cared. So at least for the price they're asking for these, you could tell they tried. They weren't just slapping a heat shield on it and calling it good. And there just are not a lot of other alternatives. This is really the only replica of the M37 to ever hit the market. And there aren't that many replicas of any other trench guns either. I mean, the Chinese copy of the Winchester 1897 comes to mind, which is in our original trench gun video. That was one of the most famous, and for a long time those were $300-400, but now they've shot up to nearly $700, $800, even $900 if you can find them, because they haven't been imported in a while. So if it's between paying, say, $700 on the low end for a Chinese copy of a Winchester, or $1,000, maybe $950 on the low end for one of these, I would really say go for one of these. Spend the extra money. The quality is definitely there. The Chinese guns were very hit or miss. They either worked or they didn't. And the manufacturing, especially under the hood, if you looked in the receiver, there were lots of rough machining marks and burrs and things, whereas this is very smooth internally. Just my opinion. I also really like the Mossberg. Of course, these are quite a bit cheaper. You could do a gun like this for under $600 new. So for a more modern look, that's definitely an alternative too. I wish Remington would do a copy of their military gun. They really don't. You can get the police magnums, but it would be very neat to get a copy of the M870 used in Vietnam with the 21-inch barrel and the NATO bayonet lug. Just there you go. If Remington's ever looking for new things to make, since they're kind of going through financial trials, do that. That'd be cool. Hi. Thanks for tuning in. And I just wanted to add this little postscript. Since I recorded the table talk, I did actually get an original bayonet from a friend. This is a Remington 1917 style or P14 style bayonet. This is what was issued with the original Winchester 1897, and it kept on until really the Ithaca M37. Well, I appreciate you tuning in. And if you own one of these or own an original and would like to talk about it in the comments, we'd love to chat with you. If you liked the video, as always, please click like. And if you'd like to help support us get to the range a little more often, please click the link and check it out at our Patreon page. We do give some benefits as best we can too. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.